We now have a new complete range of Selmer saxophones, and sitting right in the middle of that mix is the all-new Signature model. The purpose of today's video is to explain what this one is all about and put it through its paces by comparing it against a Series 2 and a Supreme. And answer the question to those of you who are wondering, as this is just a little bit below the Supreme in price, should I just save up a little bit more money and buy the Supreme? It was a pivotal moment for Selmer a few years back when they launched the Supreme, as this really marked a new chapter in their history of producing wonderful models. Now, when Selmer do produce a new model, it shouldn't really be taken lightly, because since 1922, just about all of their releases have either become a thing of legend, or at the very least, they have become very significant saxophones on the market. With the release of the Signature, we now have a complete lineup of new models for the foreseeable future. So we have the entry-level Axos, we have the Signature, which I'm largely talking about today, and we have the Supreme. We now know that the Series 3 and reference models have been discontinued for alto sax, and there remains a question mark as to whether the Series 2 will continue to be produced. For tenor sax, it's a slightly different scenario, as all three of these original models have been retired. Now, in the most simple way, you could sort of say there are three models for three different budgets, but there's more to it than that. Okay, it's true to say that the Axos might not fall into that legendary category that I mentioned earlier. This is much more about being an instrument that's accessible to many more people. But the next two, the Signature and the Supreme, they really are trying to do something special there. As for whether they become timeless models, perhaps time will tell. So what is the Signature saxophone all about? Well, in the case of the alto version, which I'm reviewing today, it's all about the evolution of the Super Action 80 Series 2. For the tenor, which I'll come on to in another video, this is taking a different course, and it's actually the evolution of the Series 3 model. So why are Selmer doing this and not doing something different? Well, you could argue that the Supreme saxophone is the thing that's different in their new range. But what Selmer have done with this new model, the Signature, is they've recognized the fact that in the Super Action 80 Series 2, it has been an absolute classic for decades. So in that sense, why get rid of it when perhaps you can improve it? And that's exactly what Selmer have done. So to explain some of those improvements in a more technical fashion, they have largely retained the entire bore structure and body of the Series 2, but they've made some significant changes to the neck. And we all know this is so important and fundamental in terms of its effect on the overall output. But beyond the changes that they've made to the neck, they have also brought in some of the innovations that they produced in the Supreme range. For example, this nice shiny looking neck receiver, they call it a 3-point concentric neck clamp. There's a few other little things as well. I'll just mention one of them right now. This octave system is a much quieter, more efficient Teflon-based octave system. And then just one or two other bits and pieces. But largely it's about just refining what was already an absolute classic instrument. And the idea is that acoustically, I think Selmer recognized that the Super Action 80 Series 2 was a great instrument, but it could do with improving in one or two areas. And they were specifically thinking about the intonation from some of the left-hand upper octave notes upwards. And they were also thinking about the response in some of the lower notes. And that's what they felt they addressed by changing the neck. To help us put this into context, I'm now going to compare this saxophone to the Series 2 and the Supreme, like I said before. And to make it more digestible again, I'm going to break it down into some shorter comparison tests and explore different areas of the saxophone in terms of its range and its dynamics and so forth. So to kick off, let's do a little test where we're playing some of the lower notes. I'm going to do some harder playing, and then I'm going to do a sort of subtone test. I'm going to try and repeat that same thing on all three models. Okay, so what I found with that first test is that there are some strong similarities between the Series 2 and the Signature, and the Supreme just parts in a slightly different direction. So first of all, the two that sound the same kind of basic tonality, but in terms of the response, I found that the Signature just responds a little bit more. The Super Action 80 kind of had a slight airiness as I was trying to go for those subtones. I just had to work a little bit harder to kind of harness the notes, whereas it just landed for me a bit more sweetly on the Signature. With the Supreme, it was great, really refined. Just everything just felt like it had a little bit more focus in the sound, whereas there was a bit more of a spread in the sound for the Series 2 and the new Signature. And really with this test in the mid-range, we're starting to get the true character of the sound that we would sort of regularly use on the saxophone, as it were, because it's that middle area, that sort of common ground that we hear all the time when we're playing the saxophone. We're starting to get the true character of the sound of all of them. And it's the same kind of thing really that I said just before there, with that character of sound coming through, where there's a little bit more spread in the sound on the Series 2 and the Signature. And the sound, again, just focuses a little bit more. It just narrows out a little bit more on the Supreme. And then in terms of the response, again, pretty similar really, but I'm just finding just a tad more response really on the Signature over the Super Action 80, which is enjoyable. But I would say that in terms of how it compares to the Supreme with that focus somehow just enables the sound to just respond that little bit more quickly compared to the other two. So they start to just pull apart a little bit in this middle ground area. And in this more general test where I'm showing off the full range of the instruments and more of the dynamic ranges, we're getting the same kind of characteristics again. I would say what's going on here is that the Supreme, as we push more air through it, becomes a bit brighter in timbre. And again, it has that focus. So the focus is pairing with the brightness. And with the Signature and the Series 2, again, they're of the same ilk. So I'm really kind of putting them in that same bracket. We're just getting that bit more spread of sound. Of course, it does go brighter when we push the air through it. And every saxophone does that. That's just a natural trait of the saxophone, but just not to the same degree as the Supreme, which really takes on that slightly brighter and more focused air, as I say. In terms of the ergonomics, I have to be honest here and say that I'm not noticing a significant difference between them as I'm playing the Supreme against the other two instruments. I can feel that they're slightly different, but it's not enough to make it a sort of a major part of the conversation, as it were. In general, all three instruments feel great under the fingers. Selmer are not going to knock out a saxophone that is subpar in this area. But what they've done with the Signature saxophone is they've largely used the same key shapings as they had on the original Series 2. There are a few things that they have addressed, which I do approve of, I have to say. For example, they've got rid of the plastic buttons here and the plastic thumb hook here, which I've never been a fan of, and I don't know why they've had it like that for so many years on the Series 2, but they've now caught up with the Supreme. They've got these kind of gold gilt things here, and they feel great under the fingers. I mentioned it earlier, but they've got this new sort of Teflon-based octave system here, and it just feels like a slightly lower action. I really do like a nice octave key that feels nice and flush against the button, as this does, without too much travel to the body. And on the Series 2 that came before it, there was a bit more travel. It felt just a little bit more faffy. So as we're using the octave key all the time, it's very important to have some nice action going on here, and that's great. But otherwise, all the sort of shaping and everything on the Signature is just the same, really, as on the Series 2. On the Supreme, I made a big deal about it before when we did the launch video on the Supreme, and they have made quite a few amendments to key shapings, making these smaller down here, for example, these two keys, and a few other bits and pieces. But as I go back to the Signature now, I don't feel that I'm really missing out on anything particularly. It still feels just very natural under the fingers, even if there are a few slight differentials between the ergonomic layouts of the two instruments. So now we come to that all-important question that I alluded to at the start. How do we choose between the new Signature model and the Supreme? So I put it to you, are you one of those people who have perhaps always dreamed of owning a Selmer saxophone? Perhaps you're not a professional or anything close to it, but you're just seeking a sax that's sort of arguably coming from the most well-known sort of top brand on our planet. And in that sense, you might say, well, it's got to be the Supreme, hasn't it? But what I would say to you is, let's look at this from a different perspective. They're both premium saxophones, but really they are trying to do two different things. So as I've explained to you throughout, Selmer are really making a point of holding on to that history, the classic Series 2 saxophone that we've known and loved for decades, and they do not want to get rid of this. So if anything, they've kind of supercharged it and tweaked it for the 21st century, if you like. And what they've done with the Supreme is that they've come up with a whole new sort of plan for the sound, and that saxophone exists over here, whereas the Signature is just taking on and furthering what we already had and what many players, many pros on the planet have loved for years. So there's an argument to say that we have just got two different choices now, and it's a case of you trying them and making that choice, and not so much being sort of bothered about the price difference, the fact that you might be missing out on £1,500 worth of extra stuff with the Supreme or whatever the difference is. Because the point is, they are both priced certainly at the premium level. I mean, that is a whole conversation in itself, the pricing, and I know many people have commented particularly on the price of the Supreme. But if we take that differential out of the way, the difference between the Signature and the Supreme, we are just dealing with two instruments that are superb in their own right. And it's just a case of perspective as to which one you go for. Here at Sachs, we will always do our best to try and hold these new instruments in stock. And I should mention also at this point that Selmer produce an array of finishes. It's not just the golds, but they do blacks and silvers and various different antiques and brushed. And they even do the super expensive gold plate and solid silver like they do with the Supreme. We might not be able to keep all of those in stock, but we'll do our best certainly to have the gold ones and some of the other more popular finishes. So we'd love for you to come down and try these instruments first and foremost, but beyond that, if you can't do that, we are always there on hand to help you and assist you. Please feel free to email us or phone us and we will answer your queries as best we can. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this video and I shall see you guys on the next one.